So probably the biggest news in the rugby world since lockdown, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, has been Manu Tuilagi's move from Leicester to Sale, which was kind of a shock move to everyone who read about it. And the reason for this is obviously COVID related and the fact that Leicester wanted to give him a contract reduction that he didn't really want to accept. So he went off and signed for Sale. Now, this isn't really going to be a video about whether Manu Tuilagi is a good player or not. I think most people who've watched him think he is a good player, admittedly with certain shortcomings. But if you wanted someone to batter down defensive lines in the middle of the midfield and take over games and essentially win them by himself sometimes, Manu Tuilagi is an incredibly good player. But that doesn't necessarily mean he was a good player for Leicester. And that's kind of what I want to dig into. For me, I think Manu Tuilagi has been somewhat emblematic of Leicester's problems in recent years. He's someone who is incredibly injury prone, and the thing is with injury prone players, and players in general, the best prediction of future injuries is past injuries. And they don't necessarily have to be the same injury. Sometimes you get an injury on one leg, and that causes an imbalance, which creates an injury on another leg. So these things kind of sometimes predict each other. And although it isn't perfect, and sometimes you'll have a player who's had a spate of injuries and then goes the rest of his career healthy, or sometimes you have a player whose career has been totally healthy and then gets hit by a spate of injuries, it's all playing these things probabilistically. But in the last 9 seasons, which must be over several contracts, Manu Tuilagi's only played 40% of the games for Leicester in the Premiership and European competitions. That is a tiny amount of time he spent in a Leicester shirt, especially when you consider the size of his contract, which is supposedly £480,000 a year, which is 7.5% of the old senior ceiling of £6.4 million. So that is an incredible amount of resources to be using on a player that doesn't even play half your games. I don't think Manu Tuilagi is the only bad decision that Leicester have made over the years. I think they've made numerous other bad decisions. I think the trade for Johnny May, another player who was going to be in an England shirt an awful lot, and a winger, which I've talked about as not being a particularly valuable position because they're replaceable, and they've gone and signed another old winger in Nandolo on a probably quite hefty contract, which I'm not too big of a fan of. They seem to be making some baffling decisions that don't really seem to fit any sort of long-term plan. I think probably the reason for this is they kept making top 4 year in, year out, and it made them think that their process was good. Now, you can kind of see by this graph here that they were probably an above-average Premiership team, but they were never dominant. They were pretty much consistently below the top 4 average in terms of points difference, which is quite a good indicator of how a team actually is, rather than just looking at wins and losses. So it was almost surprising they didn't have more years outside of the top 4 when they really could have done, and then it kind of took a plunge off a cliff, although it wasn't like the signs were there. It's probably because they stopped producing world-class academy players that they seem to be doing for decades, and that tap suddenly got turned off. And I think this is why we don't focus on it a lot, but actually how you use your resources and how you use your cap space, I think is an incredibly important part of rugby that isn't talked about a lot. Now, you might say, well, £480,000 a year, he was probably a marquee player. Doesn't really matter that much to a salary cap. But even in that instance, there's still the opportunity cost of that having him as a marquee player, because it means you can't have another player as a marquee player. Maybe you could have got an incredible player from Super Rugby who would come in and absolutely dominate the Premiership. So I think the thing with thinking about that is probably thinking, well, if he was bad for Leicester from that sort of case, maybe he was bad for Sale. I think he probably was bad for Leicester because Leicester are always going to have to rebuild eventually, and I think they haven't quite realised that. And by getting rid of Manu Tuilagi, it probably might be a blessing in disguise for them. So maybe Sale have made a mistake there. And that's my initial reaction to it, was that Sale have made a mistake. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it made sense. I think one of the things you have to think about is this move has kind of come halfway in a season. And we have to take into account Sale's league position. Now, I'm someone who thinks that teams should be thinking long-term. However, when you look at Sale's position in the league, and they're currently second with an incredibly good points difference and 7 points clear of the team in 5th, they've got an incredible chance of making the top 4, and they almost certainly will make the top 4. This is the thing with winning premierships. Coming top of the league isn't really that important. in the last 7 years, only one team that has finished first has gone on to win the title. So actually, all you really need to do is make the top 4. And then after that, you've got to win 2 games. Now, making the top 4 is about having a really, really good squad. But winning the semi-final and winning the final is about having a very, very good 23. And what Manu Tuilagi does is he probably does make Sale's 23 better. I don't think anyone's really going to argue with that. As with Leicester, by having him in the squad and spending a lot of salary cap space on him, he arguably makes their squad worse, which means they can't get into the top 4. Like this sort of short-termism from Sale, in a way where normally I'd be in favour of thinking you have to keep looking long-term and make long-term decisions. Considering where they are in the table and having this opportunity to go out and sign big players halfway through a season to essentially give themselves the best chance of winning the title, I'm sort of okay with that. And the other thing is, looking into next season, well, there's no Saracens. And considering they've been the dominant force in English rugby for almost a decade, that is an incredibly big factor in terms of making these short-term decisions. Because you can make a short-term decision that increases your chance of winning the title more than it would in any other year, where it probably doesn't make that much of a dent if Saracens are there. Because, yeah, they're probably going to go and win the league again. And although Manu Tuilagi can't be a marquee player for Sale, and they probably have other marquee players such as Faf de Klerk, he's only on £300,000 a year, which is still quite a hefty chunk, but of the Leicester, we're paying him about 7.5% of the senior ceiling. This is £300,000 out of 5 million senior ceiling, so it's only 6%. So he has taken a kind of effective wage cut as well. So Sale are spending less resources on him. And he's not there to be a squad player. He's there to be starting 13 in the Premiership final. The other thing is, it's only a 1.5-year contract. So when Saracens come back up, they can probably cut bait with him and start looking long term, especially if he hasn't stayed healthy at all over that time. So I kind of think this is a relatively smart decision from Sale, when I don't think it would have been from any other team apart from maybe Exeter in England, with no guarantee of top 4. So thanks for watching. I kind of wanted to do more Super Rugby stuff, but just as I was looking into stuff and try to take stats and things, my laptop died, so I spent a couple of weeks trying to get a new computer and things, and not having a laptop, so I kind of put it to one side. But if you follow me on Twitter at Ben Sutton Jackal, I've started making some pretty radars, I hope, about Super Rugby, and I'll keep talking about rugby on there and bits of other sports as well. And if for some reason you're interested in it, because I do a little bit of stand-up comedy, but because of the COVID lockdown, obviously I haven't done stand-up in a while, decided to start a podcast with my friend Robert Flood. And we watched Netflix original films and then say how bad they are. So if you want to watch that podcast, it's called Netflix Landfill, and it's on Spotify. I'll put the link to the Anchor thing. I'm trying to get it on Apple, but it's an absolute nightmare. I don't know why. So I hope you're doing all right. Thanks for watching, and it's not too long until the Premiership starts again, which will be a lot of fun. I mean, probably not, because I'm a Bath fan and I'm expecting us to be rubbish, but otherwise, it might be a lot of fun. So, hope you're doing all right.